So although it's a little bit as if we're speaking into the void because we can't see any participants, let's go ahead. I can see you, Andrew, but you might not be able to see me. But here we go. We're live. We're coming to you from the traditional lands of the Algonquin peoples here in Ottawa. So I honor the ancestry, the heritage, and the gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give thanks to them. So here we are from the Legacy of Hope Foundation. We are about to delve into why Indigenous oral testimony needs to be in your classroom. My name is Jane Hubbard. I'm the Director of Education at the Legacy of Hope Foundation. I identify as a settler person, and I am here today. We talk about at the Legacy of Hope Foundation as working always towards and in reconciliation. As a settler person, I'm co-presenting with Andrew Bomberry. Andrew, over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Bomberry. I'm Haudenosaunee from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, or Mohawk to be more specific. And I work at the LHF as a curriculum developer and researcher. So working every day with Jane, and this is an important topic, and I'm happy to be here to share it with you. And I would just add that all I can see is the PowerPoint. So if I look off somewhere, that's I'm not seeing any faces to engage with. So that explains that.
Okay, let's go to the first slide for the presentation today. Perfect. So just going to talk to you a little bit about who the Legacy of Hope Foundation actually is, a bit of our guiding framework and principles. So we work towards, well, first of all, we came into being in the year 2000. So we've been operating in this landscape for a very long time. Our mandate is first and foremost to educate and raise awareness about the issue of residential schools and other acts of colonization and oppression, such as the 60 Scoop, and missing and murdered Indigenous women, children, and Two-Spirit. So we do this work through outreach, doing presentations such as this, also through exhibition and through the development of curricular and other types of resources so that people can learn about what they can do and learn about the issues that surround these acts of colonial oppression. We do this by working towards healing and decolonizing. And some of the work that we do towards decolonizing is working with Indigenous teachers, Indigenous curriculum developers to actually develop our materials so that there's always Indigenous voice included in those materials. We look towards just, caring, and dignified relationships for reconciliation. We have a vision for a country that is informed and capable, and that people live as equals in a mutually beneficial, caring, dignified, and just relationships, and where reconciliation exists through education for all. We work in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and communities, and other organizations as well. The foundation for our foundation is experience and oral testimonies, of which we have a collection of over 670 plus. We also have some very unique 60 Scoop survivor testimonies, which exist as another standalone resource. I'll tell you a little bit about those a little bit later. And we have a deep caring, respect, and compassion and honoring of survivors, their families, and communities. All of this guides our work. Whenever we gather together to collect and to do research on, say, a subject for exhibition or curriculum, we either have an elder involved or we have a committee of Indigenous community members that guide that particular work. So, Andrew, if you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So what we're hoping that you take away from the workshop today is an understanding of the importance of Indigenous oral testimony, how to use those testimonies in your classroom, and a greater knowledge of the LHF's, our own collection of testimonial resources. And I'll tell you a little bit about other resources that you might want to explore as well. The whole idea of using oral testimony in the classroom, and Indigenous testimony in particular, is to look at the whole experience, not just focusing in on the trauma aspect of the story. We talk about this as not wanting to engage in what's called pity porn. We're looking at the person's story as a whole. So that experience will also include other aspects, such as resilience, such as resistance, such as agency. Those things we'll touch on later on in the presentation. Andrew, if you go ahead and advance to the next slide, please.
So it's going to talk a little bit about framing this exploration and why it's so important for Indigenous voices and perspectives to be present in your classroom and present in any kind of dialogues on issues. And so the Canadian Historical Association, I'm going to display a quote from them, but this is a nonprofit charity organization that promotes historical research and accessibility of research to lay people as opposed to just specialized historians. And so for Canada Day, they released a statement on the importance of these Indigenous histories and narratives making it into mainstream awareness. So I'm just going to display a quote here. I'm going to read it to you. So in their statement, they say, we recognize that historians in the past have often been reticent to acknowledge this history as genocide. As a profession, historians have therefore contributed in lasting and tangible ways to the Canadian refusal to come to grips with this country's history of colonization and dispossession. Our inability as a society to recognize this history for what it is and the ways that it lives on into the present has served to perpetuate the violence. It is time for us to break this historical cycle. We encourage Canadians to recognize this history for what it is, genocide. And so this is kind of a framing of these are the types of issues that can come about from the lack of or silencing of the voices of minority peoples or oppressed peoples, and how important it is to make sure that those people are actually being listened to and in the discussion. And so from this historical statement, we're gonna look at another quote from a historian that gives insight into how this actually works, as to what this means when they say historians have played a part in this. So let's move to the next slide here. So this author is a historian on historical memory and its importance and how it kind of plays out in politics, in classrooms, and things like that. Really good book, by the way, recommend it. And this one, the author is looking at how in southern U.S. they have these large historical debates or challenges between rival narratives, and what is the importance of having inclusive narratives, or in some cases actually just fact checking a narrative. And so I'm just going to display a quote from his text here from page 5. So this is how these absences work, or the presence of a dominant narrative can work. So he says, a collective or historical memory is not simply the articulation of some shared subconscious, but rather the product of intentional creation. It consists of those common remembrances that identify a group, giving it a sense of its past and defining its aspirations for the future. Collective remembering forges identity, justifies privilege, and sustains cultural norms. So in a way, how we remember things kind of frames how we discuss the present and possibilities for the future. And so if you want, you just take a moment and maybe try to think of some examples for Canada with Indigenous peoples where you think maybe that might fit the context of why this is an issue. And then we're going to move forward. We'll look into this some more and then you can see if what you were thinking kind of really aligns with some of these examples or where the differences might be. So just give a moment here. Just take a moment and think about some examples that you can think of that might fit this as an issue with Indigenous peoples in Canada specifically. All right, so we're going to move to the next slide. And in that one, we're going to look at some myths and misconceptions.
There we have myths and misconceptions. So Andrew, if you'll hit the magic button, myths and facts. Housing is free. So this is one of the misconceptions that I think a lot of people have, is that housing for Indigenous people is provided free of charge.
So in actuality, inadequate housing is a major problem for many Indigenous peoples. And it has a lot to do with who actually has title to the land. And it's basically very difficult for many Indigenous peoples to actually get mortgage loans and be able to develop. So there's actually a housing crisis amongst Indigenous communities. So the housing is free doesn't really play out well when you actually look at the facts.
Education is free.
So again, education is a very underfunded area for First Nations communities compared to mainstream Canada. And how the education funding works is kind of a complicated scenario. But by and large, Indigenous peoples struggle with having the finances to send their community members to higher education. So not really the free scenario that many people believe.
I did want to just add something there, Andrew, and that is that the amount per capita for First Nations children on reserve is actually less than for a student in a mainstream school. And that's something that Cindy Blackstock of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society is fighting for, is equality for First Nations kids.
Mm-hmm. Very good point.
Medical services are free.
So, as you might have imagined, it's actually very difficult for Indigenous peoples to access adequate or equal medical services to the rest of Canada. And Jordan's principle was created as a mechanism to try to address this lack of equal access to services and medical supports. So the framing of medical services that are free for Indigenous peoples is actually counter to the situation that most Indigenous peoples find themselves in, where they're actually unable to access services for lack of funding, availability, many issues.
That Indigenous people do not pay taxes.
So there's actually very strict regulations and situations for when tax exemption can apply. And so that's both on when making a purchase of items and also as an income. So most Indigenous peoples are paying taxes. Most Indigenous peoples are working off reserve, in which case it would be a tax-paying situation. And tax exemptions don't really kick in for Indigenous peoples unless something for a purchase, unless something is being delivered to a reserve. So most Indigenous peoples are paying taxes. Flat out.
It's also important to add that the tax exempt status is only applies to status First Nations people, not to Inuit people nor Métis people. So it's really important to be aware of that distinction as well. So.
Absolutely.
That Indigenous people often live on welfare.
So in actuality, the economic opportunities for First Nations communities is much less available than for other communities. So a lot of Indigenous peoples, they're going to be living on reserve, and a reserve is often segregated or pushed out away from resources and employment opportunities by design, kind of removing Indigenous peoples from the scene. A very literal interpretation of silencing or erasing Indigenous voices by actually literally pushing them away from things and moving them away from economic development and opportunities.
That's a whole other discussion about the reserve system that we won't get into today. But
yeah. So basically, looking at these myths and misconceptions, a lot of these myths are popularly believed in Canada. It's not by everyone, but by many people. And so these narratives they exist in an area where you don't have a large presence of Indigenous narratives that would actually counter these or correct these perspectives or prevent them from being a mainstream belief. And so these narratives, these beliefs that people have can really affect how things are viewed moving forward with any kind of supports or programs. All right. We're going to move forward.
so what is oral testimony and why is it so important? So oral testimony in the case of the Legacy of Hope Foundation's archives, we, as I touched on in our introduction, we do have this wonderful resource, and I often refer to it. It sits on a hard drive that's in my office, and I often refer to it as the beating heart of the organization. On that hard drive are sit over 670 testimonies that were gathered in between the years of 2005 and 2009 in a series of cross-Canada gatherings hosted by the Legacy of Hope Foundation and our parent organization, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. These testimonies are really important because they predate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's testimonies. So we refer to them as the Pre-Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, or IRSA, testimonies. They're very different in that they're very unscripted. There were some initial questions asked at the beginning of each interview, but then the participant was encouraged to just sit and speak, sort of a stream of consciousness, mostly uninterrupted. And it makes for a very compelling and engaging collection of testimonies where people are just really speaking their truth. And they talk about all aspects of the residential school experience, what happened to them afterwards. They talk about healing journeys. They talk about resilience and their strength and what they had to overcome and whether or not they did overcome. They're just really engaging testimonies, and we have a collection of them that we've actually put onto our website that the teachers can use in the classroom. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. So the classical approach to addressing anything to do with Indigenous peoples, basically to be absent of Indigenous voices. So even though an Indigenous topic might come up, it's not really with a large presence of Indigenous voices framing or defining the issues or solutions or unpacking the history behind it. Instead, what you mostly get is a passive view of Indigenous peoples. They're kind of a people for whom Europeans arrived, some unfortunate history happened, and the wheel of time has unfortunately rolled over them. And now, by some magic, there they are on reserves or up north or in other communities, or basically sidelined from mainstream history of Canada and where Canada is at. So this is problematic. And so I would say that there are two main reasons why this is problematic, things that they tend to cultivate from a passive view of Indigenous peoples. So one is the idea that they need to be rescued. And so this is about seeing them as people not possessed of agency, they're kind of helpless. What can they do? We would have to do this for them. And so related to that, you end up also with we need to provide solutions for them. It needs to be top down. We're going to come at you with a predefined solution that we think will work for you, and kind of a discounting of Indigenous voices, both on the existence of an issue, how it should be understood, and then what kind of a solution that can come of it. And so what we would actually recommend is a strong presence of Indigenous voices is what's really going to help to correct for these things and create a much more dynamic and democratic discussion about where things have, how history has gotten here, the present state of things, and moving forward. So the LHF would recommend an active, strengths-based view of Indigenous peoples. And then, so we're going to talk a bit about how might that actually be encouraged. And using that approach, you would redefine how students see Indigenous peoples. Instead, Indigenous peoples would be someone that need to be listened to and need to be partnered with. So partnering with is very different from being saved, where you provide the solutions, you provide the actions, and Indigenous peoples just kind of receive it. Instead, we need to flip that script to where Indigenous peoples are actively being listened to, and that Indigenous peoples are actively involved in shaping what we do in Canada, how issues are tackled and solved. So they're active partners in it. And so we're going to talk a bit more about how that's achieved. But now we're going to just do a little quick look at some more examples of how this classic approach creates problems in Canada and affects those solutions. So thinking back with the myths and the facts that we looked at, and thinking about that historical framing and that historical narrative, we're going to look at what this might end up resulting in. So for this one, so Indigenous peoples have always placed and continue to place great significance on oral testimony and oral practices. And this is through all aspects, culture, legal practice, teachings, community gatherings, and storytelling. Therefore, if you want to undo the silencing of Indigenous voices, bringing this into the education system is very key to doing that, addressing Indigenous voices on all those aspects, just across the board, and then arguably across the curriculum. This isn't something that's reserved for Indigenous studies, but it could be brought into every classroom. We'll give examples later.
So oral practices are indeed prevalent in non-Indigenous societies as well. However, Indigenous oral histories and testimonies have long been discounted and dismissed. And I think that that's an important thing to talk about. And there's a couple of really very, very relevant examples that we can discuss here. And one of those is the fairly recent, in 2014, the discovery of the Franklin expedition's lost ships, the Terror and the Erebus. Those ships, Indigenous peoples, Inuit people, had been talking for years about how those ships were located near Joe Haven, and they were essentially ignored until someone decided in 2014 or so. Someone at Parks Canada thought, oh yeah, maybe we should listen to these people that have lived here and have passed down the stories about where the ships might be located and their oral testimonies and histories. And so they did actually work with the people in the surrounding area, and they were able to locate the ships in 2014 and 2016. And the really nice outcome of this too is that they have acknowledged that Indigenous knowledges were key in locating the ships. So there was an acknowledgement finally that the Indigenous stories were proved to be true. Another nice outcome is that there's a planned interpretive center that will include testimonies where Inuit are talking about how they were impacted by the expedition, and they're telling their stories that were passed down through the generations. So that's a nice outcome. The other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that the children's bodies that are being found behind or near the residential schools, that started with the 215 children found at the Kamloops School out in British Columbia. So for years, and actually in many of the testimonies that we gathered, survivors spoke about deaths that occurred at schools. They told stories about an inordinate amount of children passing away, and those stories really weren't taken seriously until there was a body count. And that's a rather extreme example as to how Indigenous voices often ignored. I did want to mention that one because it's something that's happening right here and right now, and these discoveries will continue. Also, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their final report, it was a very conservative estimate of between 4,000 and 6,000 children that died at the schools, and that's bearing out to be true. I think the tally is up to over 5,000 now. So that's a very extreme example of Indigenous people talking about how there were so many deaths at the schools, and really nothing was done about it until there was actually bodies found. So, Andrew?
So there's a really good podcast called Canada Land, which looks at how Canadian mainstream media covers issues. And one of their recent interviews was with Laura Robinson. She's an investigative journalist in Canada, and she was covering residential schools and tales of abuse. And so a name came up, the name of John Furlong, a member or a resident of BC, a high-profile person who was involved in organizing the BC Olympics, and he came up in testimonies of residential school survivors for a school that he, once taught at, and they recorded many instances of physical and racial abuse. And so Laura Robinson reported on this, and he sued her, making certain allegations, and she countersued a libel suit saying that his accusations against her were unfair and that her reporting was well documented, well founded. And so this recently came to head in a court case. And so Laura Robinson had over 30 signed affidavits from residential school survivors testifying to abuses that he had committed. And the court did not allow for any of those affidavits to make it in, but the court did accept an affidavit by a priest who had recruited John Furlong to teach at that school. And so they allowed the priest to speak on the issue, but discounted the Indigenous voices to testify to the issue of the accuracy of reporting that there being abuses. And the court basically determined it was basically his word against hers, plus listening to the priest's testimony of character. And so these issues of discounting Indigenous voices is still very much present, still very much in action, and it has real ramifications for what happens, including in court cases. And then, so Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP in 2019, there was a viral moment for when a reporter challenged him on the idea of providing clean water for Indigenous communities, kind of framing it as like, how much? This is like, are we just writing a blank check? It sounds like a blank check. To which Jagmeet Singh responded that you wouldn't ask that question if Toronto didn't have clean water, or Montreal, or Victoria. You would just get it done. And so why would you ask that question when it comes to Indigenous peoples? Well, I would argue that a lot of this has to do with the narrative that has become common in Canada, and in that there is the absence of Indigenous voices that would create would help people understand the strengths and resiliency of Indigenous peoples, and not see them as some kind of passive victim. People who are worthy of investment, worthy of commitment to partner with an ally, and to do these sorts of large infrastructures. So I asked you earlier before about thinking about examples. So this would be a good time to make a bit of a self-comparison to what you were thinking about and some of the examples that we've given, and kind of see what you were thinking. Is it more along the lines of what we were thinking, or is it different? Is there something that perhaps you'd like to share your thinking on this so far about the ramifications of the silencing of Indigenous voices and their importance? So, Jane, how do you feel about maybe we could step out of the PowerPoint for a second and see if people have some chat comments to make?
Sure.
All right. So, anybody have any? Good question. I think that you will see the residential schools in the U.S. gaining more traction and awareness in terms of the mainstream media, in part because of what's happening in Canada. But they have similar issues to Canada in terms of racism and discounting of Indigenous voices. So that would have probably played some factor in it not being widely discussed.
I know too that they. I don't know if they're investigating them to the same extent as we are in Canada just as yet. So that could be part of the reason as well.
Good point.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump back into the slides, Andrew, and then we can take some. Oh, I was going to say, well, that's true too, Wendy. Absolutely. Yeah.
Very much so. And it's not really coming up in classes as we've been talking about Indigenous peoples as strength-based coverage, where Indigenous voices are really pushed forward and listened to. Instead, it would be, as in Canada, the traditional passive view. Yes. And time will tell in terms of the extent or fulsomeness of that investigation. And so it's a unique situation where, for the first time ever, the Secretary of the Interior is an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, no less. And so one hopes that she will take it as far as it needs to go. We will see what constraints or freedoms end up being factors in playing out with the investigation. Thoughts on the new curriculum in BC and its focus on Indigenous ways of learning? I couldn't offer thoughts at the moment. Sorry.
Nor myself. Let's continue with the presentation, and then we can address some more questions at the end, because there's still a fair bit to get through.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to jump back in, but we will check back in with the chats.
Indeed, Talia will answer your question. We'll get to that. We may have, did we jump ahead one slide, Andrew?
Uh,
Oh, maybe not. No, that's okay. Okay, no. Where are we here? Let me see.
So I believe this one is me.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's important to do a quick little historical primer here on what's going on with Indigenous history in Canada. So I would argue the history of Canada should start way before the actual Confederation of Canada. It's really important to understand certain framings. So this is going to be a very, very fast run through. But basically, at first, there was actually a lot of collaboration and dialogue between Indigenous peoples and incoming settlers, the Europeans. There was a lot of treaties, including ones for allyship, peace and friendship, and ones for economic purposes. And treaties were interpreted fairly amicably to both sides. And this would have been a reflection of the power dynamics. And so, over a long period of time, due to the impact of diseases and illnesses, there was a shift in the power dynamics, and then that shift led to increase in power in settlers, and there a lot of greed for land and resources, and racism, which led to hostile and incredibly damaging relationships that exist to this day. So, important things I want you to understand is that the current relationship that exists now between settlers and Indigenous people, has not always been this way. Specific choices have gotten us here, and different choices can help lead us out. And then, final bullet, is very important. A lot of this starts with a choice to listen to Indigenous peoples. So, listening to Indigenous peoples, introducing their narrative to part of your understanding about issues, history, possibilities. This is the doorway to seeing and understanding Indigenous peoples very differently on Indigenous peoples' terms, and it really changes how we think about what's possible. And I would just quickly add, it doesn't mean if an Indigenous person says it, therefore that is the law. It means that Indigenous peoples are a respected voice as part of the discussion. An important framing. It's important to understand that this contentious relationship is not how things started. It got here from choices and can be undone the same way. So we're going to talk a bit about how this might be undone.
So one of the best bits of advice about using oral testimony in the classroom is to just do it. And by doing so, you can get the whole story. So some of the resources that you might be able to access are the Legacy of Hope Foundation's collection of survivor testimony on our website. On that, we have residential school survivor testimony. I think there's about 50 testimonies available. Of course, it's very important to vet them before you use them in your class. We are actively seeking funding to make compilations, thematic compilations, which may be coming in the future, so that it makes it easier for teachers to access. In the meantime, there are other resources that you might want to use. Deepening Knowledge, which is a project at OISE, the Ontario the Institute for Studies and Education. They have a lot of resources that you might want to look at. There are resources at UBC and the Martin Family Initiative, which are also very useful. Also, something to remember that if you are inviting an Indigenous person into your class, that you might want to talk to your FNMI coordinator at the school. They're most likely community connected and can help you out with that. And remember too that protocols are different from community to region as well. So that's also a good question, David. I'll address that. There is a group of educators, Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators from across the country. We first gathered through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we've continued this partnership and this relationship over the years since then. And we are actually working to compile a list of well-vetted resources, which are authentic and are most excellent. There, as I said, the Martin Family Initiative, there's the Rupert's Land website is great as well. There are the Deepening Knowledge project through OISD, our own website. We have a lot of resources there that people can access. That's kind of a good way to go about it. And as I mentioned too, if your school or your board has an FNMI coordinator, have a word with them as well. So just looking at the slide talking about resistance. So it's important to understand that Indigenous people have resisted wave after wave of oppressive acts and institutional discrimination. And it's easier to see that and to understand that after you after you witness oral testimony, whether it be in video or audio format. Strengths. This is related to resistance, but also to healing and to agency. Indigenous peoples are strong. They have endured, resisted, and are working to heal from what is quite literally genocide, and that's rather remarkable. Agency, seeing Indigenous peoples as powerful actors in their own right, shaping their own lives, shaping their own history, and doing their own interpretation of the world around them. Healing, related to agency, seeing Indigenous peoples as people who are working to heal from the harms inflicted upon them by colonization. Those are things to consider. When listening to oral testimony, all of these threads become apparent. So as well, individuals and communities need to be considered. So there we go. Oh, thank you, Wendy and Chantal for bringing that to light as well. It is a good thing to check with your Ministry of Education. What we were trying to do was to collect and to collate through this organization that Legacy of Hope Foundation and CanGeo is also a part of, Canadian Geographic is also part of this organization, where we're working to put together an authenticated list of resources. So thank you, Chantal. Andrew, go ahead.
Okay. So by bringing in these oral testimonies, Indigenous voices, one of the things you're going to be doing is humanizing the learning experience. So if we want to achieve reconciliation, then there needs to be a critical understanding of the Indian residential schools, 60 scoop, criminalization and institutionalization, struggles, experiences, and healing journeys of all those involved. These are complex things, and when you listen to Indigenous peoples, you're more likely to get a more fulsome view of these things, as well as bringing in, from the previous slide, their threads of resistance, strength, agency, and healing. So when Indigenous peoples tackle these subjects, they do it in such a way that it becomes easier to see these things and to note these things. That being said, you still need to kind of teach students to look for these things, but it becomes much easier, and sometimes it becomes possible when you introduce Indigenous oral testimonies, Indigenous voices, because if those voices aren't speaking, then oftentimes the alternative is a passive framed text about these things just happening to Indigenous peoples. So to get that humanized view, you really need to listen to survivors. And so this is in part touching upon the oral testimonies that the LHF has from those who have survived residential schools and those who survived the 60 scoop. But it would also extend to other issues and other Indigenous voices commenting on the issues of the day and how we got there and how to go ahead. But yeah, so it's very important in this way as well for humanizing Indigenous peoples to get that oral testimony into the classroom, into the different subjects. And so we did a few examples of what this could look like. Sorry. So when using oral testimony, it's critical to use it in a broad range of subjects, as we've said. It's not just for a history class or an FNMI class. So it takes oral testimony makes issues come to life. They're dynamic, they're engaging. The content is very emotional. It's got a lot of heart learning to it. And oral testimony can engage students who might be struggling with the written word. So they can just actually listen to people expressing themselves, making their arguments, and outlining their experiences. And so oral testimony can transform people's understandings of issues. It's one thing to read a briefing paper on it, and it's another to hear people talk about water as the lifeblood of the people and how critical it is for their health and well-being. And then when you're listening to or watching oral testimony, right, it's not all audio, some of it's video, it makes the engagement more dynamic and gripping. Right? And then finally, using oral testimony introduces students to the primary sources, which is an important goal, I would imagine, across many different subjects. And so I did a few examples of how oral testimony could be brought in to different classes. And when doing it, or thinking of the approach, I'm going back to that resistance, strength, agency, and healing, as well as individuals, communities, and thinking about how I might draw out those through questioning. So I did a geography class because, can geo. So there's a grade 11 university college preparation course, the CGD 3M. And so one of those strands of that course is looking at development projects and mega projects. And so it says, so who chooses which projects are developed in this region and what are the different points of view of the people involved? So that is a great opportunity to introduce oral testimony. For instance, the Wet'suwet'en land defense, and actually seeking out oral testimony from the hereditary chiefs who are resisting the pipelines and hearing from them in their own words why the resistance, on what grounds, and what's the legality of it from their perspective. So bringing in those oral testimonies really challenges dominant narratives, and it can really open up students' minds to a broader discussion of how we got there and how to move forward. So these are important oral testimonies to introduce to the students. This geography class is one of them. And as you're doing it, as you're thinking of how they could ask questions, for instance, just asking the students, what is the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief's narrative on this issue? How easy is it to access their narrative on the issue in the media? How is it being framed by non-Indigenous news media, by Indigenous news media, by the police? And so the police were like press releases and such. And then thinking through that, how are you going to draw out those threads of resistance, strength, agency, and healing? And you will find that it's actually much easier to do that when you're listening to Indigenous peoples, because those things are going to be front and foremost when they're discussing these issues. So another class I looked at was a Canadian history course, grade 12, history, identity, and culture. So part of that course is about looking at the evolution of our national identity as Canadians. And so for oral testimony, a great thing to do would be to introduce a speech by George Erasmus. George Erasmus, former head of the Assembly of First Nations, gave a very powerful speech in 1992 on the anniversary of Canada's formation, and his speech was called Nothing to Celebrate. So listening to his speech when thinking about national identity, and then asking students, how does this narrative challenge the dominant Canadian narrative? Or this speech was in 1992. Has Canada changed from what Erasmus has described? And so the agency, the resistance, resilience, the healing, all of that roars through in his speech. And these are important considerations to have when evaluating such questions as the evolution of Canada's national identity. So you can pretty much bring in Indigenous oral testimony across the board, all sorts of topics across the different subjects. And when you bring them in, they really challenge these narratives. So last example, here's a law class, a lot of opportunities in a law class. So this one is a grade 11 course. It's Understanding Canadian Law, CLU 3M. So one of the strands is about the rights and freedoms. So they're asking for teachers to explore with the students, describe the legal instruments and procedures available for resolving complaints regarding human rights violations under the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Charter, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. Well, what would be a great thing to do there would be to introduce the fight that Cindy Blackstock and the AFN have been pushing for in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on the Canadian government underfunding Indigenous child welfare by a large margin. So, spoiler alert, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal did find that the Canadian government was underfunding and ordered them to make the funding for Indigenous children and child welfare parallel to non-Indigenous children in child welfare. And so the Canadian government is up to 19 non-compliance orders because they still haven't done it. So this presents very interesting questions that can be asked about what is the playing out of the rule of law in Canada when it comes to Indigenous voices. The Canadian government continues to resist, even though Indigenous voices won in the Human Rights Tribunal court. So just exploring the power of Indigenous voices and that playing out of how do we actually make these decisions, how do we proceed forward. When you listen to Indigenous voices, there's the possibility for powerful change, but there's also no guarantee because, again, there is dismissal of Indigenous voices. So these are just 3 examples of bringing in Indigenous oral testimony and how they can really expand the narrative and expand students' thinking on the democratic practice of Canada and how we would understand an issue from its history, look at it in the present, and decide on future actions. So very critical, very important for the future of Canada, and it's very important for teachers to be bringing in this oral testimony. Some other important considerations. So
one thing to remember is you don't need to know everything in order to teach the subject. And that some people can be triggered by content, including non-Indigenous people who may recognize an element of their experiences in the stories of survivors. I was giving a talk at the Canadian Museum of History 2019. I keep forgetting that 2020 existed and happened. And during that talk, I had a woman become emotional and become upset when we had played some survivor testimony, simply because she had been a Duplessis orphan herself. So she was triggered by elements of the residential school survivor's testimony, and she had to leave the room. It is important that when you're that you vet the stories first and decide if they're appropriate for your classroom. That's definitely something that obviously you can't skip that part. But perhaps before you actually air or listen to the testimony, just apprise your students of the fact that it may be emotional for them, and perhaps have a plan as to what they should do if they're feeling upset, and make sure that the classroom is a safe space for them in that way. Our focus has been on residential school themed testimonies, but Indigenous voices can be used throughout the curriculum, as Andrew had mentioned. So another thing to think of, I know that there's been some controversy about the residential schools and experiences. Some people at the schools had better experiences than others, and that depended on many things. It depended on the time, the period of time that their residential school experience actually occurred, the administration of the school where they attended. All of those factors could have influenced as to what sort of experience they had at the schools. One of the generalizations that we can make about the residential school experiences is that the system itself was inherently flawed and bad. And for that reason, anyone that went to the schools, no doubt had a bad experience when you think about it. I can remember speaking with a survivor who said, well, I didn't have a bad experience at the school. but at the same time, they had been removed from their family for a number of years, and that in and of itself was something that should never have happened. So that's just something to consider. And I know that some people may be reluctant to include, some teachers may be reluctant to include Indigenous subjects in their classroom just out of fear of, not knowing enough. But there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of resources. I'm happy to answer any questions, and Legacy of Hope Foundation has a lot of resources for you as well. And it's something that I have done in services on this subject matter. And as a settler person, I can tell you that one of the things that I do in order to bolster my speaking about the residential school history, and what I do to bolster my presentations, is to bring in Indigenous voice, because to let people speak for themselves, I think is one of the best things to do. I see we're getting close to running out of time. So Andrew, let's do that next slide, and how to be an ally to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so let's live with gratitude, live lightly on the earth.
Respect and support Indigenous sovereignty.
Learn about treaties and demand that Canada honor its treaty commitments.
Consider future generations in all of your actions.
Question and resist stereotypes, including teen names and mascots.
Listen to Indigenous news, explore Indigenous authors, poets, and artists.
Learn about your Indigenous neighbors wherever you are.
Remember that all beings, animal and plants, are your relatives, not your resources.
The last one has a thing over it for me here. Appreciate the diversity of nations, cultures, and peoples.
Perfect.
And Yahweh, thank you.
Miigwech and merci.